Good evening, and welcome to tonight's presentation. I'm Kevin Johnson, one of the board members of the Egyptian Studies Society, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Peter Brand received his MA from the University of Memphis under Bill Murnane and his PhD at the University of Toronto under Donald Redford. Since 2001, Dr. Brand has been a professor of history at the University of Memphis and the field director for the Karnak Great Hypostyle Hall project, which is focused on recording, conserving, and interpreting hundreds of scenes and hieroglyphic texts carved on the walls and columns of the Great Hypostyle Hall. His first book, The Monuments of Sety I, provides the most extensive and comprehensive study on the monumental evidence for Seti's reign. Professor Brand has appeared in over 20 documentaries. In fact, it's quite difficult to flip the channel without seeing his face on the screen, and these include the Discovery Channel, History Channel, and National Geographic. Now, most recently, Dr. Brand has published what I can confidently say is the definitive work on the reign of Ramesses II. Here is that book, and it's quite a hefty tome. And inside, Dr. Brand has been kind enough to inscribe a personal note, which I don't think he would mind me sharing with you. To Kevin, thank you for being, without question, my favorite PhD student. I could not have written this book without you. Wow. Thank you for that compliment, Peter. And I will, of course, accept any proceeds from the book, Peter, if you should wish to repay the debt. Now, without any further delay, let's turn our attention to tonight's talk, entitled All the King's Wives, Ramesses II's Royal Women. Would you please welcome Dr. Peter Brand?
Since Ramesses loves to hog the limelight, I figured at the very least he would actually get at least a cameo before he has to exit in favor of his women. So let's go ahead and switch to Ramesses' women. Thank you for that introduction. It's wonderful to be back in Denver speaking to the Egyptian Studies Society. I believe this is the third time I've spoken to you. It's always wonderful. I always like that you actually invite me in the summer. Colorado is paradise at this time of year. I want to talk to you about the royal women of Ramesses II, all the king's wives, looking at their role in his reign. This is based on the 7th chapter of my just published book on Ramesses II, Egypt's Ultimate Pharaoh. And this was one of my favorite chapters to research and write. And of course, Ramesses II is infamous, perhaps, for having perhaps the largest, or at least the largest known royal family of all Egyptian pharaohs, famous for having about 100 children. And of course, the number of wives that he must have had to father all these children. And of course, among those wives, the one that stands out, head and shoulders above all the rest, is the woman that is shown here, accompanied by the goddess Isis, which is the famous queen Nefertari, not to be mistaken for the otherwise famous Nefertiti, and of course famous for her beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Queens. But as we'll see, Nefertari was just the first among many of the royal women of Ramesses II, and it is the many wives of Ramesses II, along with Nefertari, that we will explore in today's lecture. And of course, as their role as queens and as the mothers of Ramesses' many children and as the consorts of the king throughout the course of his long reign, and their ideological role in his unique and visionary kingship ideology over the course of his reign. This was another major theme of my book, is the ideology of kingship. And Ramesses, of course, as he was the third king of a brand new dynasty, as a new king, a young king, and the third king whose dynasty had ruled for scarcely more than a decade when he came to the throne after the death of his father, Sety I, and as a very young man with something to prove, the ideology of kingship and setting his mark on pharaonic kingship, his royal women and the development of his huge family was an important part of his kingly agenda. And as we'll see, he made his mark through his huge family, including the important role that his royal women played in this. Now, another thing we have to consider in understanding the large family that Ramses had, including, of course, his many wives, is we have to confront the way that, in particular in the West, we have understood the royal families of the ancient world, especially the so-called Oriental civilizations of the ancient Near East, both ancient Egypt, the ancient civilizations of the biblical lands, such as ancient Babylon, the ancient other ancient civilizations like Assyria, the Hittites, biblical lands. Even in the Bible, one thinks of kings like King Solomon with his many wives and so-called concubines. And part of this is what is known ever since the early modern European period. One thinks of tales of the seraglio or the harem, and this continued down into modern views of more modern so-called Oriental civilizations, such as the Ottoman sultans, and the view of the so-called harem as these enclosed palaces where decadent Oriental rulers kept their concubines and numerous harem women as sort of prisons of sexual bondage and dissipation, where they lived out their fantasies of sexual pleasures and dissipation. And here we have a 19th century painting by a French artist that supposedly shows the harem of the pharaoh Ramses, surrounded by his naked women and concubines, living in decadent splendor, as some of them obviously enjoying opium, all naked and there for his pleasure. And there's a kind of decadence here. There's also a kind of European titillation by this, but also a sense of disapproval that despite his wealth and being indulging in all his fantasies, there's a moral disapproval, and despite having everything that a man could have, he is also somehow unhappy and miserable and melancholy, and he has it all, but he's still somehow miserable and feckless. And there's a titillation, but also a kind of moral judgment. And it really is a form of, it's really outdated, and it's really something we need to set aside. And more recently, even looking at more recent civilizations such as the harem of the Ottoman Sultan, a lot of these old-fashioned views have been put aside, or understanding of the ways that even the Ottoman Sultans, the quarters of the royal women of the Ottoman Sultan, a lot of these old-fashioned notions that are better known from things like the abduction of the seraglio from the famous opera by Mozart have now been dismissed as outdated, almost racist European fantasies. This has also come down through studies of ancient civilizations like Egypt, and we really have to put this aside and understand the reality of the ancient polygamy, the marriage of pharaohs to multiple women. We can't indulge in these kind of outdated fantasies. On the other hand, we have to be careful about going too far to the other direction. The pharaohs were not feminists, and Egyptian women were not liberated in any sense. And sometimes Egyptology has been a bit too optimistic about the position of women in ancient Egyptian society. This still was a male-dominated society. On the other hand, again, we have to reject these kind of Orientalist fantasies. Egyptian women in the king's palace were not confined to their quarters. their quarters within the palace. Outsiders were not allowed to go in, but the women within them were not confined to their quarters. And so they had an active role to play within court life, but access to them was by outsiders was likely restricted. So there was a one-way access point, but they were not restricted within their quarters, and they had an active role to play within court life. And in fact, there was probably a kind of women's court where women of noble court circle interacted with the king's women in a kind of active court life. And at the larger court level, the king's women also participated in the larger life of the royal court as well. Now, as far as Ramesses II's family life, we know that his marriage to multiple women began before he actually took the throne as pharaoh. Now, we understand now that he never became a co-pharaoh during the lifetime of his father Sety I. Earlier scholars, including my mentor Bill Murnane and the famous British Ramesside specialist Kitchen, who's now in his 90s, had argued that Ramses had been promoted as a kind of co-pharaoh by Sety I. My own study on Sety I suggested that this was not the case, that Ramses remained crown prince until the death of his father. However, during his time as crown prince, Sety took pains to ensure that his son would be well prepared to take his place once Sety had died. And in an inscription that Ramses left at his father's temple at Abydos, Ramses tells the story about how Sety had carefully prepared his son to take his place once he became pharaoh, and that Ramses was given a kind of on-the-job training by Sety as crown prince. And part of this was to make sure that Ramses was well prepared to have a family. And he tells how Sety gave the crown prince his own starter family of multiple royal women. And he tells us that he, Sety, furnished me with a female household and royal apartments surpassing the beautiful maidens of the palace. He selected wives for me from throughout the land. And here we actually see a scene that is actually from the 20th dynasty, the palace quarters of King Ramesses III, from his temple at the Medinat Habu, at what's called the High Gate. And it shows King Ramesses III relaxing in the private quarters of his palace, surrounded by young women that are perhaps known as the beautiful maidens of the palace. And here we see the kind of young women that would have been married to Crown Prince Ramses that are mentioned in the Abydos Dedicatory Inscription, when as a teenager, probably shortly after he reached puberty, that the Crown Prince was married to at least several young women. And then although the inscription is damaged, it goes on to tell us that shortly thereafter, there's a reference to children being nursed, to being suckled, in reference to the king having, or the crown prince at least, having sired children. And again, one can imagine as a young teenager being presented with several young eligible ladies and told to essentially get busy, that he didn't have to be told twice. And I can imagine that these young ladies were drawn from the daughters of the courtiers and the nobility of Egypt. Now, in ancient civilizations, and in fact in many civilizations up until fairly recent times, and even today in many cultures around the world, marriages are not so much love matches as essentially political alliances or commercial alliances between families. Marriages are made for, if you will, commercial or diplomatic reasons. Now, as we'll see, there were diplomatic marriages between kings and foreign princesses for diplomatic reasons. But even when a king married within his own country, and especially when he married the daughters of his own courtiers and local officials from up and down the Nile. These were essentially internal diplomacy. He married the daughters of the elite to cement diplomatic ties with important families. We get hints of this when we hear about the marriages that some pharaohs made to known courtiers in the early Amarna period, such as when King Amenhotep III marries Queen T, who is the daughter of courtiers, or when we hear about I, who is related to a pharaoh by marriage. These are well-connected elite who marry into the royal family in order to secure political relations between well-established courtiers and the king in order to cement good relations with the elite. And I can imagine that Ramses marries the daughters of various courtiers to ensure that the new royal house and the future pharaoh will have good relations with important courtiers who are going to thereby be good allies to the new young pharaoh once he takes the throne and continues the new royal house. Now, the royal women of the king's household held various titles, and the most important were the titles that showed their relationship to the king. So, of course, we have the women that we call essentially queen. But the word for queen in ancient Egypt essentially means wife of the king, the Amenhirkhopeshef. We have what might be called the senior queen, which are the great wife of the king, queen. This is the Amenhirkhopeshef. We also have the king's mother, the Mut Nesu. And then, of course, we have what essentially means princess, the Sat Nesu. And then we have king's sister, and then which is Senet Nesu. Interestingly, although some of these titles also correspond to males, such as the king's son, there is no title that corresponds to king's brother, because male brothers are threats to the king. So there's no such title that means king's brother. And then there's also this title, beautiful maidens of the palace. Now, among the most important women in the king's court are the women that are the king's mother. And in fact, we know this, one of the most important women in the court of Ramesses II was the Queen Mum. The mother of Ramesses II, a woman named Tuya, in fact, is better known from the reign of her son than she is from the reign of her husband, Sety I. And in fact, as far as I can tell, and I looked for this when I studied the monuments of King Sety I during his reign, I could not find a single monument that could be securely attributed to the reign of her husband. There was a battered limestone head that was attributed to Queen Tuya that was found at Seti's temple at Gourna, but it's not actually clear whether this battered limestone head actually dated to the reign of Sety I or whether it was actually created during the reign of her son and then left at Seti's temple. But other than that, every other known monument of Queen Tuya actually is securely dated to the reign of her son, not to the reign of her husband. And here we see some of them. And her titles are usually given as the king's mother, the god's wife, and then the great royal wife refers to her title as Seti's consort, and then also mother of the god, which refers to the fact that she is the mother of Ramesses II, who himself, of course, as a god, she is therefore the mother of the god. And she also bears a number of unique variations on her title. She can be called both Tuya and Tui, but she's also known as Mut Tui, which refers to the fact that she can be related to the goddess Mut, who is the mother goddess because she is the mother of the god, Ramses, but also is that she is related to the goddess Mut, who is the consort of the god Amun. And this is a bit of a double entendre because of a special mythology that surrounds what is known as the theogamy, or the divine birth of the king. During the New Kingdom, one of the ways to understand the fact that the king was in fact divine was a kind of official mythology that said every pharaoh was considered divine because although the queen was his mother, his father was both his earthly father, the previous king, but his divine father was none other than the god Amun himself. And there was an official mythology that said that during the reign of his father, the god Amun personified his father and then seduced his mother, the queen, and came into her bedchamber in the guise of the king's earthly father, the previous king, and seduced the queen as the god Amun, and therefore impregnated the queen, but it was actually Amun that was impregnating the queen. And so therefore, the new pharaoh was quite literally the son of Amun. But of course, in this case, not only was Amun Ramses' divine father, although Sety was still his earthly father, now not only was Tuya his earthly mother, but Tuya also became the goddess Mut. So Mut was now his divine mother. So basically he had his earthly parents, Sety and Tuya, but now his divine parents were Amun, but also the goddess Mut. So now he had 4 parents instead of just 2. And of course, Mut's, now Tuya's special role is that not only did she have an earthly husband, she was a woman who had literally known a god physically. And so she had this exalted role to play as a woman who had literally had this divine encounter with the god Amun herself. Now, if we turn to the question of the king's many children, because of course we saw that he had several wives, and already during Sety's reign, before he died and Ramses came to the throne, we know that several of Ramses' children were born. And of course, already during the early years of his reign, before he even served for 20 years on the throne, something like almost 50 sons were eventually born, and maybe more. My best count that I've been able to come up with is about 48 sons that I've been able to account for. And there could have been more. And the question is, why is it that Ramses had so many children? In particular, why did he have so many sons? And the question is, was this simply to make sure that one of them survived? Was it to guarantee that he had an heir to the throne? Now, when Ramses came to the throne, nobody thought, even Ramses, that he would have lived so long. And having so many sons was perhaps a bit of overkill. And I don't think that this was necessarily why that a king would have so many sons. And in fact, I was reading a book that was studying kingship around the world and the role of royal women, and suggested that royal polygamy, this having many royal children, that having so many children and royal polygamy, this was not mainly a strategy of ensuring an heir, but actually had to do with royal prestige. That having so many wives and producing so many children was a sign of royal prestige. If a man had a wife and having children was a sign of prestige, then having many wives and many children was basically a sign of royal prestige. And even something, did anybody remember the old movie with Yul Brynner, of course, who also was the best person to ever play Ramses on the silver screen, but he also played The King and I, and remember that scene that shows the royal children parading? And of course, he's looking very proud as all these children parade on. And that sort of encapsulates it, I think, that these children were a sign of prestige. And I can even tell you, like, I even had this colleague and friend of mine, he's a cab driver in Luxor named Sety. The man has 7 children. He's very proud of the fact that he has 7 children. So I think this is part of it. Having so many children and so many wives is a mark of prestige. And so having these numerous children is a mark of this. It's also a symbol of fertility. Now, on the monuments, we often see Ramses parading these children forward on these monumental lists that shows, in particular, the royal sons parading in the order of their birth, and also parades of the royal daughters as well. Now, the question is, how many wives did Ramses have, in particular during the early years of his reign? Now, we know from the dedicatory inscription, it implies that already during Seti's reign, that he had married several royal women, although it doesn't tell us exactly. Now, in terms of his two most senior royal wives, Nefertari and another woman named Isetnofret, that are the two most senior wives and that give birth to the children that are the most prominent of his royal children that appear, for instance, on the great temple of Abu Simbel and some of the other more prominent monuments, and who also are the ones that contribute the crown princes during the reign, and also, as we will see, the daughter wives that become the most favored daughters during the later part of the reign. These two women can account for about 14 of the king's children, and although it's possible that these two women may have had a few other children as well, it's impossible that each of these two women had 50 children each. So approximately 80 other children that are known. There must have been other mothers that produced these children. And in fact, these other women are completely unknown. Now, as we'll see, we can account for about a dozen known wives, as we will see. But for reasons that we will see as well, most of the other known wives that we will see are known from the later part of the reign, and therefore cannot be the mothers of most of the children that we will know, because most of the children are born in the earlier part of the reign, where most of the other known wives are from the later part of the reign. And in fact, as we will see, the two senior wives, but especially Queen Nefertari, have the advantage of great prestige. And Nefertari in particular was so prominent and so favored that she eclipsed all the other wives, even the secondary wife, Queen Isetnofret, that all the other wives were obscured in anonymity because Nefertari eclipsed all the others, that these other wives are completely anonymous. We don't even know what their names were. Their tombs are unknown. And therefore, the mothers of the great majority of Ramses' wives are completely anonymous. They're historical ciphers. We have no idea who they were, except that they must have existed because they produced all these children, but they're completely lost to history. And of course, Nefertari, as among her many titles and epithets, the greatly favored one, and she was indeed the greatly favored one. Her most important title, but it was just one of many titles and epithets, was the great royal wife. Now, most of the royal women were given this title of royal wife, and the most favored of the royal women were given the title of great royal wife. Now, there could be, in fact, more than one great royal wife at a time. And in fact, in the later part of the king's reign, there were actually sometimes several great royal wives. It may be that during most of the time when Nefertari was the great royal wife, during about the first 20 or so years of the reign, she was the only one, or it may be that Isetnofret was also great royal wife. But at the very least, Nefertari may have only had another great royal wife during her time as the most senior of the king's wives. But there's no question of the fact that during her flourish as the most favored wife, she completely eclipsed all of Ramses II's wives as the most favored consort and the sole one to appear on the royal monuments. Because even the secondary wife, Isetnofret, is never seen on the monuments that are created during the first 20 or so years of Ramses II's reign. As we will see, Nefertari essentially being the only senior wife appearing on all these monuments during this time period. Among the many titles and epithets that showed Nefertari's unique favor, one of these was hereditary noblewoman, the great royal wife, his beloved, the greatly favored one, the lady of the two lands, the god's wife. Now, the god's wife was a title, it had sometimes been given to royal women in the earlier part of the 18th dynasty. From the late 17th dynasty and in the early 18th dynasty all the way down to the time of Queen Hatshepsut, it had fallen out to favor in the middle and later part of the 18th dynasty, but then had been revived in the early Ramesside period. She had been known as the mistress of the Neferu maidens of the palace, and also mother of the god, because she had also given birth to the crown prince Amenhirkhopeshef. We'll talk a little bit about that later. She was the wife of the victorious bull, the mistress of the north and south. Here are some of the other various honorific epithets that she held as well. Now, she also had a unique role among the royal women, and that demonstrated her special favor was the role that she was given to play as a temple priestess and the way she was presented on the monuments, acting in consort or sometimes even alone as an officiant in temple worship, alongside her husband, or even worshiping the gods in a way that usually was reserved solely for the king. The two images on your left here that shows her shaking the system or accompanying her husband in performing rituals during festivals in the temple of Luxor. And then on the right, you can see her also worshiping the goddess Hathor here in the temple that was dedicated to her and to the goddess Hathor at the temple of Abu Simbel in Nubia, shows the unique favor that Ramses gave to her during his reign. And this happens from the beginning of his reign all the way through the 20th year or so just before her death. And in fact, the climax of her unique favor came in the temple that Ramses dedicated to her as an avatar of the goddess Hathor. And this unique favor, when he built the twin temples that were dedicated to Ramses and to Nefertari as avatars of royal divinity at the remote site of Abu Simbel in Nubia. And on the facade of the temple, you see these colossal images of the deified Ramses and Nefertari as divine beings, these colossal images striding out of the mountainside as divine beings. And inside we see various images of the queen as a goddess. In the center, you see the queen with the tall diadem crown being crowned by the goddesses Hathor and Isis. And here she is actually not just crowned by these two goddesses, she has actually become an avatar of these two goddesses. And on the other side, you here see in the sanctuary the divine Ramses and the divine Nefertari. And here they are actually being worshipped by Ramses himself. So Ramses worshiping his divine alter ego along with his deified queen. And so we see the transformation not only of the king into a god, and there's more about that in my book, but also the deification of his queen. And this, other than the deification of Queen T in the temple that Amenhotep III dedicates to Queen T in the temple of Sedinga, which is very similar to what Ramses does at Abu Simbel. Sedinga is a temple that is sort of a companion to the temple that Amenhotep III dedicates to himself at Soleb in Nubia, is another echo of what Ramses is doing at Abu Simbel, where he again is imitating Amenhotep III in creating temples to his deification in Nubia. Now, as far as Nefertari's origins, it's hard to say. Now, when they excavated her tomb in the Valley of the Queens, the tomb had been robbed a few tiny bits of her funeral equipment were found. Among them was this tiny blue glazed object. It was probably either a knob that came from a box or perhaps the finial end of a walking staff. I think it's probably more likely a box knob. And it was blue glass glazed, but it had the cartouche of King I on it. And one fanciful interpretation of this is that this was an heirloom from the family of King I. And one suggestion by a French archaeologist is that this meant that Nefertari was related to King I, perhaps a great granddaughter or a great niece of King I, and therefore that she was a descendant of I. I think this is very unlikely. And of course, the late 18th dynasty had been thoroughly discredited. So why would Sety marry his crown prince to a descendant of a thoroughly discredited descendant of this discredited pharaoh? As I suggested in my book, I think it's much more likely that when the time came to stock Nefertari's tomb with goods to the afterlife, and then they're rummaging around in one of the palaces for surplus goods to stock her tomb, they found this forgotten heirloom from this pharaoh that was in some back room of some palace, and they said, oh, take that too, we need to fill the quota of goods. And so they took it and it found its way into the tomb. Again, I think it's very unlikely that they would have associated the descendant of a disgraced pharaoh as one of the wives of the king's crown prince. It's more likely, again, like Ramses' other wives, that he was married to the eligible daughters of courtiers who were still in good odor and who had useful connections, rather than the daughters of discredited families. Now, the question is then, since Ramses married several daughters, who knows how many daughters, of eligible families of good name, why was it that Nefertari won the lottery, as it were, to become the most favored of all of Ramses' new wives when he became pharaoh? And I would suggest, and certainly it's clear from the Abydos inscription, that there were several children that were born to Ramses already before he became pharaoh, during the time Sety was still king, and that before his death, Sety became the grandfather of several bouncing baby grandchildren, including some boys. And I would suggest that during Sety's later years, the crown prince's household took on the character of what I would call a baby race, as each of the new wives hoped to become the first woman to present the crown prince with his firstborn son. And that Nefertari was the one that won the baby race. And that by presenting Ramses with his firstborn son, that she won the lottery. And that by giving this young boy, who had the rather unpronounceable name of Amenhirkhopeshef, that she won pride of place among his wives and secured for herself eternal favor as his most senior wife, and guaranteed her place as the preeminent wife once he arose to pharaoh. And in fact, she may have been especially lucky because, much like Harry Potter, that Amenhirkhopeshef was the boy who lived. It may be that other women became pregnant with boys before her, but those boys may have never been born if the women experienced miscarriages or stillbirths, or the boy may have been born but died in infancy, anywhere from hours to days to months after birth, or even a couple of years, because the rates of infant and child mortality, again, assuming that it wasn't a miscarriage or a stillbirth, 50% of children that live births were dead before their 5th birthday. It was the grim realities of life and death in the ancient world. And so who knows what tragedies Ramses' other wives experienced. So in many ways, Nefertari and little Amenhirkhopeshef were luckier than they knew, than we could possibly know. He was lucky enough to grow up and to survive. And so who knows how lucky they were. And so the prize that she won was prestige and prominence as the elite wife, and she won the whole thing over all of Ramses' other wives, to the point where, other than the second ranked wife, Isetnofret, that all the other early wives are completely unknown to us. And Nefertari enjoyed the spotlight to the exclusion of all his other wives, except Isetnofret. And as we'll see, Isetnofret only came into her own only after Nefertari herself had quite literally passed from the scene. And so it's to the second wife of Ramses II, Isetnofret. And of course, the reason why she was the second known wife is because she gave Ramses the second born son, named after his father, Ramses Jr. And we will call him Ramses Jr. because there's nothing else to call him. They didn't actually give him any other mark. He was Ramses, son of Ramses. And because he did not live long enough to succeed his father, otherwise he would have become, to us at least, Ramses III, but there was not to be a Ramses III until more than 100 years later in another dynasty, the 20th dynasty. We just call him, for lack of a better term, Ramses Jr., but he was to be the second of Ramses' many crown princes, and he would come into his own after the firstborn crown prince, the eldest son of Queen Nefertari, passed from the scene, Prince Amenhirkhopeshef. He is the first of the sons born to Queen Isetnofret. And of course, by giving Ramses his second-born son, Isetnofret secures her place as the second most favored of all of Ramses' wives. She also gives Ramses a number of his other more favored royal children. Now, Isetnofret, in fact, may have died even before her apparent rival Nefertari, and therefore her time in the spotlight may have been posthumous, and she may have gained a kind of genetic revenge, because most of what we know about her seems to come in monuments that her children, in particular her son Prince Kamwasa, creates after her death, and actually, in fact, after the death of Queen Nefertari herself. And after Nefertari and Nefertari's eldest son, the first crown prince Amenhirkhopeshef, dies, and when Ramses Jr. becomes crown prince, it is the children of Isetnofret that then come to the forefront of the royal family and come to dominate the royal family. And perhaps their now dead mother, Isetnofret, begins to shine posthumously. And Nefertari, as it seems, is somewhat forgotten. And the children of Isetnofret now shine. The succeeding three crown princes, first Ramses Jr., and then Crown Prince Kamwasa, and then at last the final crown prince who finally succeeds his father after 67 years on the throne, Prince Merneptah, who then becomes Pharaoh Merneptah, finally succeeds his father as king. Now we're going to turn, in fact, to one of the more perhaps unpleasant aspects, and to also some extent the more fascinating, if a bit icky, aspects of Ramses' reign, is the fact that 5 of his queens are also his wives. His wives are actually his daughters. And of course, this is one of the aspects of a kingship in ancient Egypt, is what is politely called consanguous, or essentially incestuous marriages. In the 18th dynasty, this tended to be brother-sister marriages, although in the case of Akhenaten, this also perhaps was father-daughter marriages. In the case of Ramses II, these were father-daughter marriages. And again, we can debate whether or not, in the case of Ramses II, these were purely ceremonial marriages, or whether these also involved children or not. We will take a look at the one possible case in a bit here. There apparently were 5 of these father-daughter marriages, and in fact, all of them, with the possible exception of one that's a bit ambiguous, seem to be daughters who were born to the two senior consorts, the daughters of Nefertari and Isetnofret. Married Amen, Bintanoth, Nefertari, Hanutmire, and Hanutawi. The most senior of these was the senior princess Bintanoth, who seems to have been the eldest daughter of Isetnofret, and may have been the eldest daughter of all of Ramesses' daughters, or at least the most favored of all of Ramesses' daughters. And here you can see here, her titles include king's daughter and king's wife. She can also be entitled great king's wife. The titles are used interchangeably, king's wife and great king's wife. In fact, this also even happens with Nefertari herself, depending on if they had enough room to write the whole title, great king's wife. And also with Bintanoth, she can sometimes be called the great female heiress as well. Sometimes we see images of the daughter wife carved on royal colossus, such as this image, which is carved on this great colossus from Memphis, which is now in the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo. We also see images on the facade of Abu Simbel, or this relief, which is carved on one of the pillars inside the temple of Abu Simbel, which shows Bintanoth as queen worshiping one of the goddesses. I think this is the goddess Anukis from Elephantine. Now, the closest we can come to saying that any of these royal daughters produced children by their father is a scene from one of the daughter wives' tombs. There are two scenes from the royal tomb of Bintanoth that show Queen Bintanoth alongside a woman who is not named, who holds the title of the king's daughter, and who is also shown worshiping, in this case, a goddess. So here we have Queen Bintanoth, and then we have a woman who is not named, but who is entitled king's daughter worshiping another goddess. And here we see again Queen Bintanoth, and behind her it simply says the king's daughter of his body, referring to Ramesses. Now again, it would imply perhaps, or you could interpret that this king's daughter is perhaps Bintanoth's daughter, but again, presumably by Ramesses. And that's one interpretation, which would imply that this princess is a daughter sister of Bintanoth, and that Ramesses sired a daughter by his daughter. It's very West Virginia, I suppose. I know I'm going to get in trouble for that. Maybe edit that part out. On the other hand, and I think this is a much more likely interpretation, and in fact, there's other scenes on the monuments where we see the royal daughters shown both as queens and as princesses. Here we see on the monuments, and this is her tomb, just because this daughter wife has become a queen, she is still also a royal daughter. And we have even seen monuments where she is given the title of both king's wife and as king's daughter. And throughout eternity, she will serve the role as a king's daughter and a king's wife. And so what we are seeing here is we are seeing Bintanoth playing the role of both a king's daughter and as a king's wife for all eternity. So in fact, these images are showing her both as a king's wife and as a king's daughter. And we even see in some ways over here behind the goddess is the cartouche of Bintanoth. So I think it's much more likely, and a scholar who has studied this, Heather McCarthy, has actually made this suggestion, and in fact, I think she's absolutely right, that in fact, what we are seeing is, in fact, we are seeing two images of Bintanoth in her role of king's wife and, in fact, as king's daughter. And here we see the images of the second of the most senior of the royal daughter wives of married Amen. And again, we see her titles as king's daughter of his body and also his great royal wife, married Amen. And even the iconography of the queen in this image on the far right, you see her wearing the costume of a queen, but her titles are both king's wife and king's daughter, and she wears the crown of a queen, but her wig includes this long side lock, which is a kind of princess type of side lock. And here we see this image of her from one of the statues of Ramesses, where she's wearing a queenly crown, but also this long side lock type, which is most commonly associated with a princess. And I think, again, it's a blend of queenly and princessly, if you will, iconography. Now, one of the ways that Ramesses favored the most senior of his royal women, his wife Nefertari, and again, his only Nefertari, as well as his mother, Queen Tuya, and then the 5 daughter wives, is to create tombs for them in the Valley of the Queens. Unfortunately, he did not create these tombs for his other wives, and he did not create them for any of his other daughters. It was only for the 5 daughter wives and for his mother and for his most favored consort. Even Isetnofret never received a tomb like this in the Queen's Valley. And here again, Queen Nefertari was the most favored by good fortune itself, because while her tomb is spectacularly well preserved, you could almost call it the Sistine Chapel of Egypt, the other tombs, and perhaps the tomb of Queen Mother Tuya is the most unfortunate in this regard, because almost nothing of its decoration survives. Other tombs, such as the tomb of Bintonoth, the plaster decoration is fairly well preserved, but the colors have been stripped away. Other tombs, some of the colors preserved and some of the plaster decoration is preserved. Some of them, it's very badly blackened with soot. But really, Nefertari is the exception to the rule, because the other tombs are largely wrecked. But when we look at Nefertari, it's spectacularly beautiful, almost perfectly intact. And we see this gorgeous decoration that shows the queen encountering the gods of the underworld as she makes her way into the underworld. And the studies that have been done, especially most recently by Heather McCarthy, shows that this unique tombs in the Valley of the Queens that were first created at the beginning of the 19th dynasty, especially by Sety I, for his mother, the wife of Ramesses I, were a new type of tombs that these early 19th dynasty pharaohs created for their royal women. And what is fascinating, and especially with Ramesses II, these are major monuments of the time of Ramesses II, and some of the most beautiful monuments that were created in the time of Ramesses II, so beautifully preserved. And yet, we never see Ramesses himself, or even so much as his cartouche, appearing in these monuments. And what seems to be happening is that there's almost a taboo. And Anne Macy Roth has looked at this and suggested that there's a kind of taboo against naming the queen's husband, so as to prevent his presence from interfering with the queen's journey into the afterlife. And so it's ironic here, some of the most beautiful and spectacular and unique monuments of Ramesses II are ones where we don't even get to read his name, because all the focus is on the queen and her unique journey into the afterlife. And of course, they're just so spectacularly beautiful. And although these were just one of these beautiful monuments of Ramses' other royal women, their tombs are just a shadow, whereas Nefertari once again gets the limelight in her almost perfectly preserved royal tombs. But the tombs of Queen Tuya and of the daughter wives were just as spectacularly beautiful as Nefertari's, but just a shadow compared to this. Now, the last royal that I want to look at is one of the several royal princesses from foreign lands that Ramesses married. This was the first of two Hittite princes. Oops, why is this not? The first of two Hittite princes is Ramesses. So in the 34th year of his reign, Ramesses married a Hittite princess. And there were great negotiations behind the scenes as he haggled for the bride with the Hittite queen Putakhepa. Well, I talked about another lecture when I looked at Hittite relations, and I talked about this, the only person perhaps on earth who really gave Ramesses a piece of her mind. But finally, after some rather tense negotiations, Ramesses married this Hittite princess. And he made a big deal about it by creating a number of inscriptions to celebrate the match. And she arrived in Egypt and was given this elaborate new Egyptian name. We don't even know what her Hittite name was. And Ramesses spun the event to make it sound like the Hittite king came in supplication and offered up his daughter and a lot of tribute, as if the wedding gifts were tribute. And of course, he never talks about all the gifts that he gave to the Hittites in exchange. And then he gave her this elaborate Egyptian name, Nefertari, which means something like she who sees Horus, the perfection of the sun god Re, and even gives her a title of the great royal wife and mistress of the two lands, because the Hittite queen had extracted a promise that she would be given the title of great queen and would be superior to all the other foreign queens, including the princess of Babylon that Ramesses had married. And then Ramesses, when he set up monuments that mentioned her, and here we have one of the great sandstone colossal statues that mentions her. It also gives her titles as the daughter of the great chief of Hatti. And this is a kind of royal souvenir that was handed out to the high officials, now kept in the Petrie Museum in London. On one side, it has the cartouches of Ramesses, and on the other side, it has the cartouche of Queen Nefertari, and then it says, the daughter of the great chief of Hatti. Now, in terms of how many wives we can account for, we can count up about 11 known wives. There's, of course, Nefertari and Isetnofret, the first Hittite princess, Nefertari. We know of a second Hittite princess whose name is unknown. We know there was at least one Babylonian princess, a Syrian princess. There may have been a couple of other foreign princesses whose names are known, and I didn't even add them to this list. We have the 5 other daughter wives, but there may have been several other wives, because we have at least 80 other children, and even this may be only the tip of the iceberg. I would not be surprised if we're talking about 20 to 25 wives. And even that may only be the tip of the iceberg. And now, why so many wives and why so many children? And ultimately, the way I would put it is the royal family of Ramesses II was essentially mirrors of Ramesses' own greatness. They reflected the glory of this great ancient sun king. They were part of his program of royal ideology that magnified his greatness. They were part of the glory of Ramesses II, the ultimate pharaoh. Now, I just want to call your attention to some of my pursuits. The Hypostyle Hall project, which we have a website that talks a lot about our work at Karnak, recording inscriptions from the time of Ramesses II. My articles and even a couple of my early books, academic books, can be found on my academia.edu page, including my Sety book. I have a Twitter page where I talk a lot about things related to Ramesses II. And I think now with that, I'd like to thank you very much.